Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, back here with you on the Libertarian Angle. I've got a guest host this week, Mike Swanson. I met Mike, maybe about a year or so ago. He had sent me a copy of his book, and I get a lot of unsolicited books from authors, and usually I can pretty well peruse them, quickly determine whether they're the kind of book that FFF reviews or talks about. And when I got this book, I would immediately notice the cover. It's called The War State, and it has a picture of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, delivering his military-industrial complex talk, and so that got my attention. But as I started looking at the table of contents and started, thumbing through the book, I realized this thing is absolutely fantastic. And I took this book home, and I couldn't put it down. I mean, this book hones in on the real crux of what's going on in America with respect to the warfare state, which I consider a much graver threat to our freedom and our well-being than even the welfare state. And, as most of you know who have been with us for 25 years, most of our focus in the early years was on economic liberty, and rightfully so. The socialist tide that has taken over America in the form of the welfare state. But especially since World War II, the warfare state is a much graver threat. And I think a lot of free market advocates, they don't recognize that. They've come in through the economic side of it like I did, but they don't really have a firm grasp that how the warfare state, the national security state, is a much bigger threat to our freedom and well-being than even the welfare state. And so I thought, I'd invite Mike on to come and talk about his book, give us a little bit of idea of why he wrote the book, the theme of the book, and just to share his perspectives on the national security state, or the war state as he calls it. So I'll turn things over to you, Mike. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you here.
Well, it's an honor to be on the show. Thank you very much, and for the kind words regarding the book I wrote. My background was, a long time ago, I was in a graduate history program, and I've always had a love for American history. And my father actually served in the Pentagon when I was a little kid. But for a period of time, when I was a teenager and in college, I was really interested in American history, and I was reading book after book after book about American foreign policy and the national security state and topics associated with that, such as the history of the CIA, some more unsavory stuff that they've been involved in, and on and on and on. And at some point, though, I kind of got to a point where I had read all these books and wanted a bigger understanding that kind of would link all this stuff together so I could really understand it. Because that's one thing about the world we live in. When you look at the news and current events, there's always like something going on at the moment, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or ISIS, the wars in Iraq that was started in 2002. There's always some big event going on almost all the time, and it's hard to understand how anything is connected with each other. So I was asking myself, how can I understand all this in a big picture kind of way? And I just came up with the metaphor of a war state, that in the subtitle of the book is the origins of the military-industrial complex and the power elite. And the military-industrial complex, of course, is a term that Eisenhower coined in his farewell address to describe what he said was a potential threat to our system of government when it comes to civil liberties and constitutional checks and balances. And that was the growth of the military-industrial complex, meaning the Pentagon and the defense industry and congressmen linked to that, kind of like an iron triangle of influence. In fact, in the draft of this speech, he put in military-industrial / congressional complex. So it's basically an iron triangle if you want to use political science terminology. And then the phrase the power elite comes from C. Wright Mills, who used that in the early 1950s to kind of describe the exact same thing. So I was putting those two terms in the subtitle, hoping people would recognize them, and then linking them to this phrase, the war state, which is something I kind of came up with as a metaphor for myself. But that's a real challenge in this topic, is to come up with some sort of language or phrase to make sense of it all. And the one I used, I think, actually has its limitations, which can talk about soon. But, another term someone has used lately to describe this is double government, which is a book I saw you talk about and went and read. So that's his phrase for what I'm basically trying to trace the origins of.
Yeah, that's Michael Glennon's book, National Security and Double Government, which was just an absolutely awesome book, too. We're reviewing that in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And, in fact, we're commissioning a review of your book as well. What was beautiful about your book is that it's so readable. I mean, it's not this academic tome where, somebody's going to get mired down and, you give this big picture. You show what happened here. And I consider this one of the real watersheds in American history. I mean, we see these various periods, these various events that have transformed America. The Great Depression and the New Deal in terms of economics. You had the Spanish-American War was the watershed toward empire. But the national security state is the big one. That came into existence after World War II, as you point out so great in this book. And you've got the National Security Act of 47. You've got the huge standing military. And I'm glad you raised Eisenhower's speech because, it's a really remarkable speech. And I think that's what got my attention when I saw that you had Eisenhower there on the cover of your book, is it because Eisenhower is saying something very profound. I think it's possibly the most profound farewell address since maybe George Washington's, because Eisenhower is saying to the American people that there's a major change here. I mean, he acknowledges that America has never had this thing before, this national security apparatus, this huge standing military. And he says it's necessary because of the Cold War against, America's World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union. Now, I question that, and I've been questioning that in my writings. But even if you accept that notion, the fact is it was this revolutionary transformation in American life without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. Now, Glennon calls it the double government. You call it the war state. Others have called it the deep state. I refer to it as the fourth branch of government. I think that when they brought this huge standing army into existence, and the CIA and the NSA and this huge defense apparatus, all these army of defense contractors and military bases all across America and around the world, that this effectively automatically became the fourth branch of government without even a constitutional amendment. And it automatically at the same time became the most powerful branch. So Glennon points out in his book that this is where all the power is centered now in the United States. In this branch, it's the information acquiring branch. And then, of course, you go back in history, which I just think it's so fantastic. It's a readable history of what the CIA, the other component of this thing, was doing with regime change operations in Iran, which we're still living with today, Guatemala, which produced a civil war lasting some 30 years and killed more than 1 million people. You got the Chile regime change operation. I mean, so Eisenhower was showing, beware. This is a major threat to your liberties and your democratic processes, and this, as you call it, this iron triangle. And I think I know we're still living with the consequences of it.
Oh, definitely. And the thing is about these terms, like you just use the fourth branch of government. Actually, that's a good way to put it, because to me, like the war state metaphor is kind of like a description of the consequences. That when I started I decided I wanted to really come up with a metaphor and figure out a good way to write about this. It actually broke away from American history for a couple of years and started reading about ancient Rome and the Roman Empire and classics and so forth. It developed a good way to write that could appeal to a lay person or just someone who isn't interested in reading all these academic type of history books that I've been used to reading. But the war state metaphor is kind of like a description of the results, and the results since 1945, when really this national security state became ingrained in our system of government. If you want to date it, it would be 1947 when they passed the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, created the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and actually the four branches of the military, and on and on and on, really institutionalized all this stuff. Before then, there was no real central intelligence agency. The intelligence activities that went on as part of the American government were all kind of disorganized, and one branch of the Army or the military would do something, the FBI was doing something, and it was all not really institutionalized. And we didn't have these covert operations going on in other countries to try to influence governments like what the CIA really started to institutionalize. But the problem with that metaphor is it's a description of results. It's not really a description of how it works, meaning how is it associated as part of our system of government. The double government phrase, I think, is an interesting phrase because it gets closer to that. And then the deep state phrase is something that Peter Dale Scott coined, but I saw it mentioned on television a couple times on Meet the Press, and people such as Bob Woodward has used it in passing a couple times, which I found really interesting when he did it. But it's a very obscure kind of phrase, and the real problem is that the fourth branch of government, I think, is actually a little bit more descriptive of it. A phrase I like, and I did use in the book, is one Arthur Schlesinger used, which he called it a permanent government. That's the phrase he used, and he dated it actually to starting with the Franklin Roosevelt administration in a book about the Kennedy administration called 1,000 Days. And what he said was that before Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal and World War II, if you would go into the White House and look at the executive branch of the president, you would only see like a dozen or so really important advisors, sometimes even less than that. And then with Franklin Roosevelt, government expanded, and he had to create all these, increase the bureaucracy, increase the number of people just to manage the New Deal. In fact, Schlesinger says something like he did this on purpose to create a new type of government where he could enact the programs and do things that he wanted to do. And so he dates it actually starting to then. And then, of course, he claimed it just took on a life of its own so that whoever the president is dealing with this permanent bureaucracy or government that his predecessor had, and then when the president's gone, his successor is going to have to deal with too. And even if some of the personnel at the top change, their faces change. So Hillary Clinton's gone, Condoleezza Rice was there before, and who knows who's going to be there next time. We've got John Kerry now. But the policies seem to continue, and not with very little real changes. And that's what the Michael Glennon book, the Double Government book, really brought out, which I really appreciated. So I think this permanent government phrase is a really good descriptive phrase, and it kind of links in with what you just used of the fourth branch of government, because when you use one of those two phrases, now you're kind of getting close to thinking about how does this thing actually function politically. The war state is the result in the sense that since World War II, what we have seen is really permanent, endless war. and if not a big war, then a small action somewhere going on all the time, covertly or overtly. And that's, it's hard to think of a single year where our country has not been engaged in a covert action or overt action of troops on the ground somewhere in the world since World War II.
Yeah, because I think they have it backwards. They say, well, we need this huge apparatus to deal with these crises. And what they fail to acknowledge is that the apparatus itself, most of the time, is the cause of the crisis. And you can look at this. A good example is ISIS. I mean, there was no ISIS before the U.S. invaded Iraq. It's a direct consequence of the chaos that they brought. But it was a fundamental change in America's governmental structure. And I think that's what many Americans just don't realize. And this is what Eisenhower was saying. This is a fundamental change. And the reason I like the Glennon book, which again is called National Security and Double Government, is how he shows how they've maintained what really is effectively a fraudulent perception of what's going on. That he calls it two sections. The Trumanite section, which is the national security section, that's the military, the CIA, the NSA, and so forth. And then you've got the Madisonian section, which is the traditional three branches of government, the judicial branch, the congressional branch, and the executive branch. And that all of the power is centered in the national security branch, but that everybody plays this game, making it look like everything's operating like it has since the inception of the country, that the judiciary is the one that has final jurisdiction, and you've got the legislative branch enacting the laws and the president enforcing the laws, where they maintain this aura to make people feel good when really there's been this fundamental transformation. Now, one of the reasons that I call it the fourth branch of government is because of what happened in Chile in 1973. In Chile, they had essentially the same type of governmental structure that we have now today and have since World War II. They had the three branches of government. They had a long established tradition of democracy, but they also had this military intelligence branch of the government, the national security branch, which again was the most powerful branch. And the power came in when the national security branch decided that they needed to oust the president of the country. They didn't like his policy. He was a Marxist, a socialist. And the military just said, we're taking him out. And so you had, you can see it on the internet, these jet planes, Hawker Hunter jets, British made, that were coming in to attack the president on the part of the national security branch of the government. The Air Force was coming in, attacking the executive branch. And the national security branch won, and they ultimately made it just one branch of the government. They abolished the legislature, and they made the judicial branch obey whatever commands they did. And that's when it hit me. And now what was interesting about this, it was illegal under the Chilean constitution, under the Chilean laws, was that it was the U.S. military and the CIA at the School of the Americas that was telling their Chilean counterparts, this is your duty. That is the duty of a national security branch of the government to oust a president when the national security branch considers it the president is a threat to national security. Well, that to me is a fascinating concept because our Constitution doesn't provide for such a thing, and yet here you have an entire branch of the government believing that that's their duty. And so I think that was a game changer for everyone. I think that's one of the reasons why the judicial branch of this government here has erected a wall of immunity around the CIA and the military, where they can't be sued, they can torture and assassinate people, and they can't be sued, they can't be held criminally liable. I think everybody recognized that this was a game changer. There's a new sheriff in town, and that don't push this branch too far. Don't cross any red lines because of the overwhelming power they have vis-a-vis the other three branches.
Well, if you look at the topic of American foreign policy, intervening in other countries, and what happened in Chile, these type of subjects, if you just take the Chile story, in the past, a lot of times if you decide, well, I'm going to go study these things and try to figure out what is the cause of America, because the United States helped support those generals that overthrew that government and through the Central Intelligence Agency. And one thing that you'll find in the literature are arguments to say that a lot of this is economically motivated, that when the United States, let's say, intervened in Chile, we were doing it to help, I think it was T&T as a conglomerate that was invested over there. In the Middle East, it's a saying, we're intervening for oil or for Halliburton or to help defense contractors and all this kind of stuff. So there's an argument that all this is economically motivated. I used to believe that myself, but I don't believe that at all anymore, frankly, because when I started to really study the 60s and the 1950s and the origins and all this, there is some truth that the power of this so-called military-industrial complex, part of it does rest from profits in companies that are involved in this, donating to congressmen. But the people that are making the decisions to intervene in Chile or go to war in Iraq or whatever the case, that's rarely the case. They think they're doing the right thing. They're not doing this for economics. And if you want to trace the real, one question I've had is, where does the real power for this system come from? Like in Chile, where was the power that these generals had to overthrow the government? How did they have that power? Because it wasn't in their constitution. It was illegal. And in our country, why is this system so ingrained and so powerful? And I think the answer is that what these things represent is war and the ultimate defense of a nation against foreign enemies or even domestic enemies or whatever. And they, at times, which is what the people in Chile argued, is that, if we aren't given power or allowed to do these things, even if they're bad, then our whole society will collapse. So we are defending society against Allende in that situation. And in our country, nothing like that has ever happened. But you can see sometimes arguments of a similar flavor. For example, with the NSA spy programs, there's a speech on YouTube by General Michael Hayden, who was head of the NSA on 9/11. And in his recent speech he gave about the programs, he said that he decided on his own to ramp up the NSA spying against people he thought were interesting, even if it wasn't authorized by the president or courts. This is before Bush created or made changes to these FISA courts. He said he decided to just do it on his own. And he believed that he had the total authority to do it, and that he kind of said something to the effect, I'm not exactly quoting him, but something to the effect, I didn't have to ask Mama to do it. And he says that we've got the Constitution with the Fourth Amendment, and I respect the Fourth Amendment, but it's also my duty to look after the clause that says something in the Constitution about the common defense or something. I don't remember the exact phrase. So, the people can twist things and justify anything they want to, but in the end, maybe there is some truth that they do have the authority to do these things, even if we can't legally find it on a piece of paper. It just might be the nature of government that the government has the duty to protect itself, and you could take that logic to wherever you want to go, which is what happens.
I think you hit the nail on the head, that this is a branch of government that believes that that in some instances it is the final arbiter of what needs to be done to protect the country. And but they maintain the Madisonian branches, the aura that the Madisonian branches, as Glennon puts it, are in charge. People think, well, President Obama is making these decisions like closing Guantanamo. It never occurs to people the possibility that the Joint Chiefs of Staff simply tell Obama, you ain't closing Guantanamo, period. This is the way it's going to happen. And there could be any number of other instances where the national security branch is the most powerful branch. I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you talk about in your book, where Bobby Kennedy tells the Soviet ambassador, he says, look, my brother is under tremendous pressure from the military. We fear a coup. And John Kennedy himself feared a coup. I mean, that was when he got that novel 7 Days in May made into a movie with Burt Lancaster and everything to serve as a warning, just like Eisenhower was warning that, hey, this is a dangerous apparatus we've got here. Now, you raise a very fascinating question, is why is it part of our government? It never was before. And you go into in your book very well about the anti-communist crusade, that, boy, communists were coming, and they got away with it for 45 years about, boy, there was danger of communists infecting Latin America. That was part of the rationale for ousting Allende, that the communists were going to encircle the United States and finally the dominoes were going to fall. That's what Vietnam was all about. And then they lose their official enemy that they use to scare people. I mean, fear is the coin of the realm of the national security state. They've got to keep people scared. And so then they go into the Middle East and they start poking hornets' nests, sanctions on Iraq. Madeleine Albright declares that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it. The anger starts boiling in the Middle East. So you end up with all these terrorist attacks on the USS Cole, the embassies in East Africa, 9/11, all the would-be terrorist attacks since then, Fort Hood and Detroit and so forth. And it's all this idea of, just as you point out, constant war, constant threat of terrorism, keep people riled up. Compare it to Switzerland. You don't see the Swiss all pacing the floors in anxiety and fear and depression. Why? Because their government is limited to defense, to defending their country. They don't have foreign aid of dictators. They don't get embroiled in other people's disputes. They don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And really, Switzerland was the model for the founding fathers of this country. I mean, that was why they didn't have a standing army, an enormous military industrial complex. They had a basic military force, but nothing like it is today. And they opposed getting involved in Europe wars and Asian wars. And it was a totally different lifestyle, totally different governmental structure as compared to what happened after World War II, as you detail in your book.
Well, one thing about the national security state, the war state, the fourth branch government is that, if you the thing about it is, first of all, as Ron Paul has argued, they kind of create their own enemies by intervening throughout the world. It creates blowback, and then we have to intervene as a result of the blowback. So it's kind of a vicious cycle, and I think that's actually becoming more and more apparent from what's happened since 9/11 to anyone who really wants to pay attention and look at things rationally, and not just, be scared all the time. I think that's quite obvious. However, one argument as a result of that is, well, let's just be smart and stop doing that, or just intervene in a smarter way. And that's kind of, I think, what Obama came into office saying, was I'm just going to be smarter than Bush. And the result is actually, it's continued, or in some ways it's gotten worse. The situation today seems to be worse than it was before Obama got in office as a direct result of the intervention in Syria and the intervention in Libya. So we haven't learned anything, the government has not learned anything. So then I think we need to ask ourselves why, why not? And I think that's something no one really asks. And I think the answer is that, and it's very difficult to understand, is that what we're dealing with is a bureaucratic system of power, or a bureaucratic structure. And there aren't many books that talk about bureaucracy, and it's hard to learn about it. But this topic is actually how I've learned about it, and it is probably the best topic to study about it. But the thing that happens in a bureaucracy is that it tends to look for things to perpetuate itself and to expand. So if you are, let's say, someone that's making war plans for the Air Force, you're going to look at potential threats and how to deal with them, make plans for those threats, and then your bosses can go to Congress and say, hey, we need these airplanes or we need these weapons to deal with this threat over here. And then the people that are running, the generals running these units or these forces, their whole life is fantasizing about getting into a combat in order to prove themselves and to advance in rank. So there's a whole interest that develops in perpetuating this, looking for threats, exaggerating threats, and defeating the threats that are out there. I believe that's a core at this problem. And the same can go, the Air Force is a little extreme. That results in bombing. But the same goes for, I think, the NSA or the CIA or any of these organizations. It's all about expanding their budgets, looking for reasons to do that. And they believe in what they're doing. It's not just that these people are purely selfish. Everyone, you could say, is selfish, but they don't think of themselves as that way. So then I think if you accept that, then what is a way to stop all this or to limit it? And the only way is to shrink all this somehow. But that doesn't seem to be on the horizon at all.
Well, I think the question that everybody's got to ask themselves is, what is the role of government in a free society? And do we need a national security branch of the government? Do we need this vast military establishment, the CIA, the NSA? And I think people have become so accustomed, it's been inculcated in all of us since the first grade, that this is necessary for your safety, that if you don't have this, my gosh, America's finished. And that's what I think needs to be questioned. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people saying reform the Pentagon, reform the CIA. I say dismantle these things. That restore the founding principles of this country. We don't need this huge standing military. We don't need the CIA. We don't need the NSA. They are really totalitarian apparatuses, and they were brought into existence to fight totalitarianism. That's what they were effectively saying, is we need a totalitarian apparatus to fight totalitarianism. I'd say that was a totally fallacious and false and dangerous thing, that they should have fought totalitarianism with freedom. And that I agree with you. Most of them, if not every single one of them, is well-meaning. They really believe that they're keeping America safe, that they're in Iraq because people are going to come to the United States and take over the federal government or something. I mean, their hearts are in the right place, but as Justice Brandeis once said, that sometimes the people that are your greatest threat to freedoms are the ones with zeal and who are really trying to do their best with government power. I say that we ought to raise our vision to a higher level in this country, restore the founding principles of this country, where you don't have the huge military-industrial complex, you don't have the CIA, the NSA, you restore a peaceful, free, harmonious society. Unfortunately, Mike, time's up. Greatly enjoyed the show with you. Thanks for coming on as my co-host. And let me repeat that Mike's book's called The War State. Absolutely fantastic book. I cannot recommend it more highly. And by the way, for a certain period of time, Mike's got the ebook version of this book on sale on Amazon for 99 cents. So I don't know how long that's going to stay, but take advantage of it now. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.